Hey, what's up, y'all? It's your boy Preston here, and this is my post-fight reaction to Charles Oliveira dominating Max Holloway to a unanimous decision win, and stuff like that. Congratulations, Charles Oliveira. And honestly, this is the one thing that I will say, that, honestly, I'm gonna get to that, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And stuff like that. You know what I mean? But overall, man, this was a clinical performance for Charles Dubronx Oliveira. You know what I mean? And I'm just saying, and stuff like that, and he used, and bro, Charles Oliveira can fucking throw hands, bro. And I don't know why it's just like, it's sometimes like depending on the fight, but I just feel like it's just when he fought against Dustin Poirier, when he fought against, Justin Gaethje, and stuff like that, or Justin Gaethje, you know what I mean? Like, you know, and preferably when he fought against Dustin Poirier, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Honestly, he could have traded with Dustin Poirier, in my opinion. I feel like he was just kind of just waiting and for that perfect moment for him to stop Poirier. It was getting, but he was losing those rounds pretty badly. He had to find some type of way to quickly stop the fight. From like he had to quickly stop the fight. And stuff like that. You know what I mean? From trying to choke out Dustin Poirier, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? So, and in this fight and shit like that, it's just more of like, it's just like he knew exactly what he needed to do in this fight, man. It's just like, he knew that he had to, he knew that he was naturally the more bigger fighter, and shit like that, you know what I mean? He had 10 times the grappling skills than Max Holloway, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And overall and shit like that, like he literally got to work, bro. Like he literally got to work, man, with this and shit like that, you know what I mean? And I'm just saying, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? So credit to Charles Oliveira, man, because I ain't gonna lie though, man, like it just, because taking down Max Holloway ain't something that's easy, bro. Like, like Volkanovski couldn't really take him down like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing. I mean, well, he took him down to the ground, but it took him a little bit. He really couldn't take Max Holloway to the ground. But honestly, though, Max Holloway is naturally more bigger though than Alexander Volkanovski, and now realizing it, and shit like that, you know what I mean? Volkanovski walks around more smaller than Max Holloway and shit like that, or they could be walking like, nah, I'm pretty sure because yeah, Max Holloway definitely walks around more bigger than Volkanovski. But honestly, I feel like genuinely that happens in MMA, and stuff like that, where just somebody else will walk around definitely a lot more smaller than the other person. But I mean, if they make weight, that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? It just like, there's not much like always evenness when it comes down to strength and ability and shit like that, when it comes down to, in the UFC and shit like that, you know what I mean? It's like there's not really a difference there's a big difference when it comes down to in the UFC when it comes down to the size and stuff. But it's just that's something different because people could walk around like, at like when they, because Oliveira, he's been at the lightweight division basically his whole career, and shit like that, you know what I mean? So it's just more of like at the same time and shit like that, you know what I mean? Like he's gonna be walking around at like weights like 170, possibly sometimes 180 if he feels like, and shit like that, probably 180 is a little, I don't know, and shit. I don't know how these UFC fighters be doing it. But I just feel like they just do whatever they do, whatever weight cut they have to do to get to draining their weight and shit like that, you know. But that would be a, you know, because I mean, like at the lightweight division, 155, and you're at walking at 185, 6, and 8. I mean, that's not that fucking bad. That's only a 30 pound difference and shit. Like that's not that bad, you know, and shit like that. It's not like, you know, it's like, it's not like it's a 50 pound difference, or it's damn near getting where you're draining like almost 100 pounds off of you and shit like that, you know. Like that's the thing and shit. But it could still get definitely hard on you and stuff like that when it comes down to that, you know, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And and that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? So yeah, you know, and shit like that, you know what I mean? So overall, you know, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Um you know what I mean, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Like, you know, credit to Max Holloway, credit to Oliveira, but I'm just saying, like, and at the same time and shit like that, you know, it's just what I'm saying is that, like, Oliveira probably walks around again, like I said, at like 170 pounds or at like 180 pounds, you know, and shit like that, you know, like on, like, you know, on his days, you know, and shit before, you know, he has to get ready to getting ready for another fight, you know, and stuff like that. He walks around at like 170, 180, you know, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Um, you know, but, you know, Max Holloway, you know, and shit like that, you know what I mean? You know, he walks around probably at the average weight of probably 155 pounds, you know, and shit like that, you know what I mean? Honestly, I feel like he gets more, I feel like he's more lighter than 155 pounds a lot of the time, you know, because I mean, like, because remember, he's a featherweight. You know, unless if he's, well, I don't know, because I mean, he's naturally, like, he is getting more bigger and shit like that, you know, and he is getting more, like, kind of bigger and more of the lightweight and type of standpoint, you know, and shit like that, you know what I mean? So, in that kind of case of scenario, you know, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Like, you know, that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? So, but yeah, you know, and stuff like that. But he probably walks around at like, you know, around like, you know, like, you know, like one, like, you know, probably like, you know, like, you know, 150, 155, 160. I feel like that's kind of like the range of where, like, but he could also probably weigh more than that too, you know, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know. But I'm just saying, like, the biggest thing is just more of like, you know, what I'm just more just trying to say is the weight difference and shit like that. Because Max Holloway, it's like, at the same time, it's just more of like, you know, like, at the same time and shit like that, you know, with Max Holloway and shit like that, you know what I mean? And stuff like that, you know what I mean, and stuff, you know, is that basically, like, you know, is that like he was a featherweight and stuff like that, and when he was a featherweight, that's the thing. So it just he's but he still has fought more in this weight class, so he still does have experience. But at the same time, though, he doesn't have as much experience because he's an elite fighter. We already know how good Max Holloway is. So I mean, it just there is empathy to give Max Holloway. You know what I mean? And it's just more of at the same time and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Like, you know, like, he still is new in the lightweight division. You know, it's like, you know, that's the thing. He still is very new in the lightweight division, you know, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing. So it's just his growth, you know, and shit like that is probably not all the way there. And it's especially now of what I seen, you know, and shit of how he got rolled up by Oliveira like that, you know, and shit like that, you know what I mean? It really makes me think that it's just like, not, definitely not to go down in weight, but it's just more to solid your weight up. Maybe it's to solid your muscles up, you know, and stuff like that, you know, because it just, because honestly, when I was looking at Oliveira and then when I was looking at Max Holloway and shit like that, you know what I mean? Like, and even if you could look at this photo, it almost looks like it's a featherweight going against a lightweight, or maybe like a lightweight, or maybe like a welterweight going against a lightweight and shit like that, you know. But that's not Charles Oliveira's fault, and shit like that. Even though Oliveira could a little bit slide for the welterweight division, I ain't gonna lie though, and shit like that. You know what I mean? But it's just more of like at the same time and shit like that. You know what I mean? That's also something too. But you can see the weight difference, and shit like that. Like you like of Oliveira and of Max Holloway and shit like that. You know what I mean? So that's the thing and shit like that. So it's just like, and knowing of how good Charles Oliveira is, that's the thing and shit like that, and that's kind of just what happened. He had he just was the more bigger person, and stuff like that, and it just and when he and when they sized up on each other in that fight, I was like, oh shit, like because Oliveira was giving him like almost like kind of like a kickboxer stance, which I don't know if he has. I mean, which he probably had maybe a little bit of class, maybe like a blue collar like orange belt in taekwondo or some shit back in the day or some shit, but at the same time and shit like that, it just he was still pressing him and was kicking him and everything, and it just at the same time it just he really showed his difference of size, and shit like that, when it comes down to in this fight, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And I'm just saying, and shit like that for sure, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And let me see if I'm still recording. There we go. And there we go. But like basically that's the thing, man, and stuff like that, so overall, um with Charles Oliveira, man, like he's a good fighter, man. I mean, with Charles, he's a fucking really good fighter, man. And the one thing I wanted to say and shit like that is that after this fight, man, I feel like Charles Oliveira is now should be considered like to being one of the greatest lightweights, man. Like I know he needs to. I feel like he needs to have more legacy with getting a title, and shit like that, Which I mean, Makachev, like he isn't in the lightweight division no more. He's in the welterweight division now, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? So overall and stuff like that, you know what I mean? So that means he got a chance, and who has that? What? Oh shit! I mean, Ilya Topuria got that belt. Fuck, and shit like that. You know what I mean? But that's the thing and shit like that. You know what I mean? But but overall and shit like that, you know what I mean? That's the thing and shit like that, and overall, like Ilya's a really good fighter, but it's just after this kind of performance, man, I feel like that's kind of a fight that, should end up being next, in my opinion, and shit like that, you know what I mean? Is Ilya Topuria versus Charles Oliveira, the rematch, and shit like. Oh, Ilya's already fighting somebody. He's already fighting somebody. Oh, let me look. I think he's fighting Justin Gaethje. But yeah, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? But yeah, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. You know what I mean? But yeah, Justin Gaethje, he is fighting. Ilya Topuria, he's fighting Justin Gaethje, in UFC Freedom 250. I don't know why they changed it up like that. Like the numbers of the UFC and shit like that. You know what I mean? Of like because I mean it probably could be just how many times they've had what that is probably when it's like two title fights, and like you remember like Islam Makhachev, Volkanovski, um uh uh um if I'm not mistaken, it was Kamaru Usman versus Colby Covington, which was the championship belt, which was the UFC champion belt with hold on, sorry guys. Can you All right, but we back and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? But overall and shit like that, when it comes down to it and shit like that, you know what I mean? Um that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? Like, it's just um and yeah, and shit like that. You know what I mean? So overall, that's gonna be the fight, and that's gonna be a good ass fight though, bro. Ilya Daporia and Justin Gaethje. That's gonna be a really good fight right there. Like because again, they both got built, but again, like what I was saying. Kamaru Usman versus Colby Covington. That's another example of freedom, UFC freedom to whatever, and shit like that, or won something and shit. Probably was that time, but like, but basically, because again, Kamaru Usman, he was the UFC welterweight champion, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Colby Covington was the was the uh was the interim champion, and shit like that. If I'm not mistaken, or like because I believe because he called out Usman when he had the interim belt, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. You know what I mean? So, um, in that kind of way and shit like that. I think so. Let me actually go look that up. Actually, no, it wasn't like no UFC freedom of none because the reason why is because like it would have been because I mean like because Kobe he won he got the interim belt and stuff like that when he fought against Rafael dos Anjos and shit like when he fought against right Rafael dos Anjos. Let me look. But yeah, but like but basically, he Kobe Covington, because he did win the belt against Rafael dos Anjos, but then he got the belt stripped because he was unable to fight Tyron Woodley and stuff like that. You know what I mean? So so Kobe Covington had like got stripped of the belt, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. You know what I mean? So so yeah, and shit like that. So it would have been, but it just because of a injury and you know how things happen, and shit like that. You know what I mean? Um, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? But it just that's how Dana White rolls, I guess. And shit like that. You know what I mean? But I feel like he could have been a little bit more lenient about that, in my opinion. But it's just more, but I wonder if it just goes with the depending on the fighter and shit like that. You know what I mean? Because I know like him and Colby Covington didn't really have like the biggest like likings of each other really, and shit like they had they had tolerance days and shit of each other, but it just but at the end of the day they just did not really like each other, Colby Covington and Dana White. So I mean there was that right there, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. You know what I mean? But but yeah, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But either way, and shit like that, Ilya Daporia, he's already gonna be fighting Justin Gaethje and shit like that, so that's already off the loose right there and shit like that for right now and shit like that for Charles Oliveira. But there's still other fights for sure. I mean, there's definitely still other fights out there. I mean, there's Arman Saruski on, and shit like that. I feel like that fight right there should be definitely. I think that's a fight that actually should happen, and shit like that, because Arman's in the lightweight division, right? Let me see. But yeah, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? But basically, Charles Oliveira and stuff like that, you know what I mean, and stuff, that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean, and stuff like, he can fight Arman Saruski on because they're both in the lightweight division, and shit like that. You know what I mean? Um, and shit like that. Like I'm pretty sure Arman is ranked in like the pretty damn sure he's ranked in the top 5. Probably lower than that. Possibly even in the top 3. And shit like that. Ooh, I mean, he probably top 5, definitely top 5 Arman Saruski on, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But that's definitely the next fight, for Charles Oliveira, in my opinion, and shit like that, you know what I mean, is to get, that fight with Arman Saruski on, and then after that, the winner of that fight and stuff like that, you know what I mean, can go on and go and fight the winner of Ilya Daporia versus Justin Gaethje, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? I mean, it just makes sense, I mean, like, and it just with Arman Saruski on saying uncuff him, uncuff him. I mean, like, and I haven't really seen him get any big opportunities like that, and that's the one thing, bro. Like, I have not seen him get any big opportunities. So I feel like that fight right there, if he wins that fight against Charles Oliveira, which bro, you got a big match right there. But even though he can wrestle, though, I mean, I looked up it. Even though I looked it up and he definitely can, like, wrestle and shit. I haven't really seen a whole lot of fights, but I've seen some highlights of him, and shit like that. He definitely slick, and shit like that. Can strike well, and shit like that. You know what I mean? I would definitely, gonna watch it like definitely for some more footage. But I know enough to know that Oliveira, I feel like in that fight, stylistically for Oliveira, it could be more of a competitive fight than of what the fight was like when he fought Max Holloway and shit like that. Because Max Holloway doesn't prove, and shit like that, at the end of the day, he's a striker and he's not a grappling artist, shit like that. You know what I mean? Obviously, he ain't a grappling artist, but it's just more of but it's just at the same time, and shit like that, like and I just feel like really, in the UFC, is just wrestling realistically, wins battles, I guess, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And shit really depends on the match of who you're going against, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, but it's just more of like at the same time and shit like that, you know what I mean? It definitely proves that in this fight, and shit like that, where wrestling is gonna win the match over striking, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, because Oliveira was taking those shots, and he was just blitzing through, and he did that shit very, very fucking well, man, and shit like that in this fight, and he blitzed in there extremely well, and stuff like that, got a hold of Max Holloway. After that, it was just over, man. Because he could have choked him out right there. He could have, he could have, just like just done anything he wanted, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. But what makes sense now and shit like that for Oliveira, and shit like that. You know what I mean? Is what's next, for Oliveira and shit like that for sure, and stuff like that, is I think, he should fight Arman Saruski on, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And, and fight in a main event and shit like that, and shit like that on Paramount Plus, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And, and fight, and stuff like that, each other, where whoever wins that fight and stuff like that, you know what I mean, is going to fight the winner of, Ilia Topuria and Justin Gaethje, because Oliveira isn't the only person that deserves that spot, of who's ever wins that fight with Ilia Topuria and Justin Gaethje. He ain't the only person that deserves that spot. Arman Saruskian also deserves that spot too, and shit like that. So whoever wins that fight, and shit like that, you know what I mean, should go against each other. And if I'm not mistaken and shit like that, you know what I mean, I think Oliveira actually fought against Arman. Actually, let me actually go look at that. He actually did fight Arman Saruskian, and he actually lost that fight against Arman Saruskian. It was a 3-rounder, a unanimous decision win. Let me go and double check. Yep, and Arman won by a 3-round unanimous decision and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, So overall and shit like that, actually and shit like that, I mean, we could see that, or Arman could just go and fight the winner, actually, of that fight. So either way and shit like that, but yeah, and shit, but I mean, there could be a rematch, because I mean, like, at the same time and shit like that, that was, like, I don't know when that fight was. I mean, the fight was in 2024, but honestly, I feel like at that point, I feel like Arman Saruskian deserves it. But either way, that was a really good win for Charles Oliveira. And he's going to be dominating now, and it just, whoever it is, I just don't see them handling, the pressure, and it just doing it. Like, I just don't think anybody's going to be able to defeat, Charles Oliveira until he gets that chance to the title, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And and that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? But overall and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And stuff like that, it's just like, at the same time and shit like that, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, and stuff. So either way and stuff like that, Oliveira, and stuff like that, did his thing in this fight, dominated all rounds and shit like that, Now with Max Holloway, what's next for Max Holloway? With Max Holloway and shit like that, I feel like what's next for Max Holloway and shit like that is I just think he should just really focus on training and shit like that, you know what I mean? Get more lean into the in the lightweight kind of form, you know what I mean? And I feel like more kind of focus on that. Take some time off, to rest and shit like that, or just step in there again and shit like that. Because I mean, at the same time and shit like that, you're gonna have to be a real top dog to even match up with Max Holloway. If you're not a top dog like that and shit like that, you know what I mean? Which Oliveira is a top dog. You like if you ain't a top dog, it's just you can't match up with Holloway. You know what I mean? So he could get so there's many a fights for Holloway out there. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit. But it just at the same time and shit like that. You know what I mean? I just feel like just the rest. And shit like that. Just focus on on family and focus on just the recovery process of everything, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? But yeah, and stuff like that, But it would be actually a good fight and stuff like that, Max Holloway versus Paddy Pimblett. I'm just saying, and shit like that, you know what I mean? Because at the same time and shit like that, Paddy Pimblett's still a good fighter, even though he got manhandled by Justin Gaethje, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But he still can fight, and he still got hands, and he still got the capability of being a champion, and shit like that, and overall and shit like that, and if you're a top dog, you could match up with Max Holloway, and we know that Paddy Pimblett is a top dog, but what kind of top dog are you? You know what I mean? And I feel like Max Holloway would really give him that test and shit like that, to see how much of a top dog he is, and shit like that, you know what I mean? So I mean, there's definitely Paddy Pimblett, and shit like that, and yeah, I feel like, honestly, to be honest with you, I feel like that's the. I mean, he could try to fight Dan Hooker, but I mean, nah, that's an easy win for Holloway, and shit like that. You know what I mean? Gamrot, well, I mean, Gamrot does know how to wrestle, but I mean, also Matu's Gamrot. There's also Matu's Gamrot, but I mean, just off of where the arrow's pointing red to down, where it's pointing down. It's looking like because like he lost or some shit. Let me look. Oh, so he hasn't really. He has the upcoming fight. He's fighting this Rebovix dude. And yeah, and shit like that. You know what I mean? Recording right. Let me see. There we go. But yeah, he's fighting this Rebovix dude, and yeah, and shit like that. So that's happening, but I mean, like I said, and shit like that, you know what I mean, and stuff like that. I feel like what would really bring the numbers and would really bring hype, and shit like that. And honestly, what can honestly be a pay-per-view fight, to be honest with you, and stuff like that. And honestly, knowing with Dana White and stuff like that, you know what I mean, that most definitely can be a pay-per-view fight, even though it's not a belt on the line or anything like that, and shit like that, especially because all the belts are literally taken from the lightweight division, because the championship, the lightweight championship belt taken from Ilya Deboria. The interim belt is taken by Justin Gaethje, and now the BMF belt, the baddest motherfucker belt is is taken by now Charles Oliveira, and shit like that, So I'm just saying, and shit. But either way and shit like that, there's still two big names, and I'm pretty sure people would still pay to watch that fight, and shit like that. You know what I mean? But at the same time and shit like that, I mean, honestly, it would be cool to not have it pay per view since I mean, there's already Paramount Plus and shit like that. You know what I mean? And people are having to pay money to having to pay for Paramount Plus, and shit like that. You know what I mean? So I'm just saying, and shit like that. So I mean, it would be cool to just have that fight honestly for free. To be honest with you, but I'm just saying like, but yeah, but in all honesty, that fight should be free, and shit like that. Between uh Max Holloway and Patty Pimblett, and stuff like that. But I think that's definitely what, like, if he was to get in there, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And but honestly though, like, because he didn't really take really any damage really from Oliveira really and shit like that, so I mean he could definitely recover. I mean he still took a little bit of damage from Oliveira, and shit. So I mean he's still gonna have to recover, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And stuff like that and everything else and shit, But but I mean if he's there and shit, he definitely can. But Patty Pimblett is there, he definitely can fight Patty Pimblett. But whoever is there and makes up a statement and shit like that, like they could go and he could, like, Max Holloway can go and fight him. I mean, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? But I mean Arman Saruskian is strictly, off because I mean he's gonna be probably gonna, because he's most likely gonna be fighting the winner of Ilya Topuria versus Justin Gaethje, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, so and yeah, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? But overall, recapping of this fight, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Yeah, Oliveira just won every single round. But basically, how he did it, and stuff like that, he was in a very good stance and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And stuff like that, and he was moving tight, and he was moving, light with his feet, and shit like that, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, he was moving light with his feet and shit like that, and so that was something right there that he was doing and stuff like that, and he was moving light on his feet. And then overall, then after that, when he was doing that, then he was blitzing, Max Holloway, to striking and shit like that, you know what I mean? And then basically that's where he would go, he took, Max Holloway to the ground. Realistically, any type of move that Max Holloway wanted to do, even if he wanted to throw a punch, and especially if he threw a kick, that would just be an easy move for Oliveira to counter, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And to grapple him and shit like that, I mean, he still could have probably snuck in a more painful kicks, and shit like that, I mean, it just, knowing with Oliveira, that's not gonna stop Oliveira from going forward and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. That's not really gonna stop Oliveira from going forward, and shit like that, you know what I mean? So in either way, even though Max Holloway, he was still throwing his shots and everything else and shit, but it's just more of like Oliveira wasn't having none of that shit, and he was just in it, and he grabbed him and shit like that, wrapped him up, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And it just body slammed him to the ground, and it just, the whole fight was just basically on the ground, it was little to no striking. It was just basically, when it was on the feet, it was Max Holloway basically just trying to survive, and shit like that, trying to, trying to make it a stand-up fight. But it just, he wouldn't persuade at it, and shit like that, and he would get taken down to the ground and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? And yeah, and shit like that, you know what I mean? So that was just kind of just the whole fight realistically. You just got rolled up this whole fight, this complete grappling domination by Charles Oliveira, and shit like that, from round 1 to round 5, won every single bit of every round. by a domination, and basically did what I said, and shit like that, and just counterattacked on everything that Max Holloway was doing, and just grappled him to the ground, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And the one thing Oliveira was using definitely some good ground and pound strikes. Honestly, I feel like, like to be honest with you and shit like that, you know what I mean? I feel like, that he could have honestly threw more strikes to Max Holloway, but I feel like he was honestly wanting to be nice, to Max Holloway, because he's the goat, because he's a goat, man. I mean, we know what he's done and shit, and shit. I'm a very big Max Holloway fan, and shit like that, you know what I mean. So it just like you got to show, respect, and shit like that, to the elite fighters and shit. But at the same time, if you already got that much openings, might as well just also go and expose that, and he could have thrown a lot more elbows, a lot more punches, and honestly, he could have tried. Honestly, like, because there was no way that Max Holloway was gonna get away from that jujitsu hold that jujitsu hold that Charles Oliveira had on, on Max Holloway and shit like that. Like, there was no way that Max Holloway was gonna get away from that jujitsu hold. There was no way he was gonna get through that jujitsu hold, and shit like that. So he could have honestly thrown more punches, throw more elbows, and shit like that, or just throw way more punches and way more elbows and shit like that. And he definitely could have got the stoppage, but I feel like he was just being nice and wanted to go rounds. And honestly, and it was still entertaining, and it was more shocking because it's just more of like, because it's just more of like at the same time and shit like that, because it's I thought Max was gonna like avoid all that shit, and shit like that. But it just, and of course, even during times if he did get taken down, he would still avoid it. But it just, Oliveira's level of grappling, it just, you cannot deny. And it's just, the one thing with Max Holloway that I also am getting now is whenever he goes against a high level of a competition that has really good grappling skills, that's where you start to see a Max Holloway where where he will potentially can really lose a fight, because I know it could be like that with anybody, but I feel like that's honestly could be his weakness though, and shit like that is going against elite grapplers, because at the same time and shit like that, even though he didn't get thrown around by Volk like that, but Volk isn't really like even though Volk can grapple and he could take anybody to the ground, but depending on the fight and shit like that, you know what I mean? Volk is more just gonna try to just, do whatever. Like he's more of a striker, Volk, but he still will grapple at the same time. He still got beautiful ground and pound if you want to try him or anything like that, like he's still got that on it in his sleeve and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, so yeah, and shit like that. But like either way and shit like that, you know what I mean? Like, it's just like, like if Max wanted to leave that many openings, like he could have got taken down by Volk also, you know what I mean? Like, because he wasn't one, because he didn't really exchange like that against Volk, and he was really getting outstriked by Volk in that fight, in the third fight and shit like that, and he just got completely outclassed in that fight, and shit like that, like when I say completely outclassed, he got outclassed, beat up in that fight basically, he got actually fucked up in that fight, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But but either way though, he still fought his ass off, and either way and shit like that, Max Holloway ain't done, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And shit like that, and he said if he say he ain't done, he ain't done, and shit like that. And either way, we know of how talented of a fighter he is. We know what he can bring to the table and how good of a fighter, he is to when he goes against the high competition of fighters and shit like that, so we know what he can do and shit like that, Max Holloway, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But it's just that night wasn't his night. And that's the thing, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But overall and shit like that, thank y'all for watching this video. Oh yeah, and I will say, I was wrong on this prediction because I was going for because I did pick Max Holloway. I honestly thought Max Holloway was gonna outclass. I thought he was gonna outclass Charles Oliveira in my opinion. And shit like that. You know what I mean? But I was wrong on that. So yeah, I was wrong on that prediction, and I will admit that. But hey, and shit like that. You win some and you lose some. And shit like that. You know what I mean? But yeah, and stuff like that. But either way, and stuff like that, thank y'all for watching this video. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. I'm Preston. Peace out, man.